Okay, good morning. This is Richard Hsu. I'm co-head of Shearman's Privacy and Data Protection Practice Group. Today, I'm very pleased and thrilled to have as my guest Ian Glazer, who's the Senior Director of Identity at Salesforce. Ian, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me here. It's great to be here.
So, Ian, I heard you speak at the IAPP conference. I thought you were a fantastic speaker, so I thought I'd invite you to the podcast and start by telling me a little bit about, what you do at Salesforce and what is a Senior Director of Identity?
It's not entirely obvious from the title, is it?
No, it's not.
I'm part of the product management team here for our identity management products. And I've been at Salesforce about 2+ years. So not only do I work on designing our identity products, but also really advising our customers on how to use identity management services, both to serve their employees and to delight their customers. Before I came to Salesforce, I ran part of Gartner's Identity and Privacy Strategies research. So I had been working as an analyst looking at both identity management and privacy issues, which is kind of the way I ended up at IAPP this year with Laura and Heidi, and had a great panel talking about navigating the maze of online retail, talking about how identity data flows and that you have both privacy concerns and requirements to meet, but that there's a strong identity management component to that as well. And that can actually help you as a privacy professional sort of guide the questions that you need to ask your suppliers and your service providers to sort of meet all the requirements that are out there.
Now, when you say identity management, I mean, do you see that as a subset of privacy? Or tell me a little bit about what you mean by that. Okay.
So it's funny. You hear a lot about the tension or the codependence between security and privacy, right? That tends to be the headline-grabbing conversation between two disciplines within the enterprise that rightfully have a lot of both relationship and tension. And that's healthy and it's important. Identity management's always been, in my opinion, the missing third leg of the stool. And here's why. See, identity management is often the answer to the question, who has access to what data? Right? So identity management provides the tools that give you access to applications inside the enterprise and data inside those applications. Now, we do a bunch of other stuff, too, besides giving you like a great user experience in terms of, say, single sign-on to applications. Mm-hmm. So in my opinion, identity really is this missing third leg of the stool, because if you think about the way many, not all, but many privacy requirements are expressed to security, they're about access to information. They're about access to resources. And the way security actually meets those requirements is they implement identity management. So we're sort of the go-between in a lot of ways in terms of implementing the solution to privacy requirements. And at the same time, we're also often the custodian of customer data, because these are the sign-on services that your customers are using to get to your resources. And so we have a custodial relationship over a lot of what can be very important, very valuable information, but also the trust of our customers because we're managing that relationship.
Right. So is it really the fact that identity management focuses on more the personal identifiable information as opposed to just general, say, non-personal identifiable information? I mean, is that generally the approach?
I mean, one could think of it that way. There's plenty of identity information that isn't necessarily PII, but that we're brokering a customer's connected relationship with the enterprise. So you could still be a non-identified. So you could be pseudonymous using, say, a social identity. And that could be self-asserted. So you created your own social identity, and you're using that to access resources that an organization, this could be a government, this could be a university, this could be private sector, get access to information. Now, that is not necessarily a flow of PII per se, but it is brokering the relationship to a customer, and that's something that identity management oversees. Now, as the organization, I want to increase the value of that relationship. It becomes very natural for me to want to know more about that individual. I'd like to move them from being pseudonymous to someone who's more known. Now, that may be validating their shipping address, right, their home address, because I want to ship them some goods. I don't really need to know who they are per se, but I need to know there's a valid shipping address there. And it might be, because of the business I'm in, something where I need really strongly identified individual. I need to actually prove them. I want to maybe consult a credit bureau to see if they match credit records or other things. And then suddenly you find then there is PII involved. Then the relationship is much more strongly identified. But again, the technology that identity management professionals use has remained the same. And the relationship has remained the same. What's different is now the data either we've collected or transited between different parties.
It sounds like when you look at it from an identity management standpoint, this is the first time I've heard this term, you're looking at it, the actual data in a more nuanced way, perhaps. Whereas from a privacy standpoint, you sort of just treat it sort of all the same way, with sort of the same level of importance, or that's not how you'd characterize it?
Well, so I would say that traditionally, identity management has looked at the processes of establishing a relationship and making sure that relationship is appropriate have been the primary focus. And by that I mean this. We got our start as an industry really focusing on employee identity. So HR would have its set of information. Some feed would proceed to an identity system, which we would then create your, say, Active Directory account and your email address, and then we'd give you access to all of the back office systems you needed to do your job. So we were looking at the ways of delivering the right access to the right people, the right place, and the right time. And that started primarily working with HR data. Now, those same kinds of techniques could be applied to other kinds of information. So that means customer data, for example. So first we think about the user journey, right? How do we get the individual, whether they're an employee or they're a customer, to the things they want to do? How do you get them to the awesomeness that your enterprise provides, right? That could be online learning, it could be government services, or it could just be, hey, I need access to Office 365 because I want to write a presentation. So how do we get that user through that journey? Then how do we do that securely? How do we use standards to protect that whole process? And then we have progressed into, oh, by the way, what other consent information and privacy preferences should we gather, because we're now dealing with customer identity, for example. So it's become nuanced over time, but first we're thinking about the flow, the user journey. Then how do we make sure that experience also mitigates risks that are associated with it? And then we start to graduate into higher order things, especially as we start to look at our customers' information.
When you talk about identity management with customers and users, what is generally their response? Does that really resonate with them, or this is really more a way for the enterprise to address this issue?
So there's a little of both. On one hand, if we as identity professionals do our jobs well, you never know we're there. Right, we are the salt of the main course. We are not the main course itself. Right, we're not the steak. We're actually the seasoning. Because if we do it right, then the user journey is incredible. They are using, say, a social identity to get access to resources. They don't have to sign in multiple times. They feel like they are being recognized, that the services they interact with know who they are, know the nature of their relationship, and they didn't have to do a lot, and that they feel comfortable with the controls we give them to say, yeah, I do want to be contacted on these channels. Maybe email's okay, but never text me, as a for instance. So if we do our jobs right, we really do become sort of invisible, both to the enterprise and to the end customer. Now, to be sure, there are specializations, let's say, that the enterprise wants to see in terms of oftentimes security-related requirements, and making sure that the identity services meet those requirements. Do we know who the individual is? Can we authenticate them strongly, as a for instance? And then there are certainly optimizations that the individual wants. I want to be able to express control over the attributes, the information that I'm giving the enterprise. I want to be able to use an authentication mechanism, for example, using a social provider, my social identity, as a way to get access to these things. So there's a common core, if you will, and then there's optimization for both the enterprise and for the individual. But again, if we do our jobs right as identity professionals, all you get is a great experience. All you get is something that is value add for all the parties involved, as opposed to something that's onerous and difficult and cumbersome and actually can lead to things being less secure. So we're going to try to avoid that, obviously.
Tell me a little bit about how identity management, how well that works, or how it compares working in Europe versus the United States, where things like notice and consent are obviously emphasized much more. Human right to privacy much more emphasized. Tell me a little bit of the difference across those two.
Yeah, so in my current capacity, as I've been talking to customers around the world, what I first noticed, and this is going back a couple years, was a reticence on the part of European customers to use social identities to begin the relationship with a prospective customer. And in the intervening couple of years, now they're all like, yeah, that's fine. We're totally good with like someone sign in with a Google identity or LinkedIn identity, as for instance. And I think partially because they see the prevalence of those mechanisms for sign-on, and they understand the user experience is so much better to the individual. And at the end of the day, we all want to delight our customers. This is just a small way to do that. Now, more specifically, what I find in conversations with customers is there is a consistent desire for the ability for the individual to control their consent, control their privacy preferences. I think the difference in the conversations I have between, say, North American and European customers is how early in the conversation does that point come up. So I think there's actually a great deal of similarity in the conversations I have, depending on what side of the Atlantic you're on or what side of the Pacific. It's just sort of the order of the conversation. So it's not that conversations with U.S. customers, they are completely ignorant to or unwilling to hear the requirements around consent, around self-control of attribute release, and around ongoing or third-party use of information. It's just that part of the conversation happens at a different time. Even when you think about right of erasure, right to be forgotten conversations in the EU, we get those, and customers want to know, how do I self-service so an individual can say, that's it, I'm out, I don't want to use your service anymore, please decommission me from your systems. And at the same time, I have those conversations in the US. They may not use the same language, but they want to know, what happens at the end of the relationship, and how can we give that individual, that customer, an opportunity to, of their own volition, end that relationship. So a lot of the principles are all the same. The conversations are the same. It's just the order in which we have these conversations, and maybe a bit of the attention that they get in our conversations is a little bit different.
Do you think, since you talk to a lot of customers, you've been doing it, what do you sort of see? Is the privacy issue something that has just sort of been growing very steadily the last few years or last couple of years, or has it really escalated recently? Or, what is kind of your overall, how would you characterize the concern with privacy, sort of over, so how would you draw the arc about the concern for privacy?
So I would say that it's always been there in some form, right? It has never maybe been fully expressed, but there's always been a set of requirements around how are we going to respect and protect this customer's information. Now, obviously, over time, there's been a lot more media attention to issues of privacy, especially with customer information. Right. And so that has, let's say, increased the scrutiny that programs that touch customer data get by higher level executives in the organization, by board, by media, by partners, etc. So there's been a sort of growing increase, let's say, in volume. So this crescendo of concern over privacy. But the good news from my perspective is what's being asked of identity professionals, and in a lot of cases what's being asked of security professionals, isn't changing per se, right? It comes back to, if you have empathy for your customer, right? If you care and value the relationship with your customer, you are going to take the right and necessary steps to protect their information out of respect for that customer. So that in a lot of ways, the privacy conversation has become more defined in the sense of there is XYZ regulation or there's this self-regulation in this industry. So there's been more clarity around language. But again, the core of the conversation has remained constant, and it comes back to the principles of the organization and the respect they have for their customers. So the arc has been more public scrutiny, more public attention, let's say, but all it's done is reinforced the good practices that enterprise need to employ. And occasionally new things start to come in. And so sometimes those are adjacent to identity management, like, oh, okay, we got to think about cookies and notice on cookies, as a for instance. Not really an identity thing. It's more of an adjacent sort of like, oh, right, there's a user journey aspect to it. There's a security aspect to it. So that sometimes that happens. I think right to erasure is one of those that certainly touches identity management, but we're, again, facilitating. We're not driving that. We just want to make sure, yes, we can provide a way to both accept the signal that the individual wants to be removed from the system and execute that to the best of our capability. But it's a larger conversation for how the enterprise delivers those things as well.
Earlier, you were saying that, if you do your job right, then the customer doesn't even know you're there. It sounds like then part of your job is to really be much more in tune with, say, the customer experience than, say, if you were just looking at it from a privacy standpoint where you're just talking about privacy and maybe not as tuned into the customer experience, or how would you say to that?
Oftentimes, the identity systems do become one of the major delivery vehicles for user experience, for the user journey. Now, we're more often than not in support of a service delivery team. That could be sales or marketing. It could be the folks that are building a new mobile app. And we're helping them out. So they're the ones who are setting the tone in terms of what's the brand experience we want the individual to receive? What are the promises that we've really made them through our, years in this market, or as a government agency? What's the promises we're making our citizens? Then that reflects on what is the user journey we want the individual to go through. And then from that comes, what are the things we need to do to appropriately protect that journey and deliver it? And that's where the identity team comes in. So often we'll get handed a set of requirements that say, well, the brand experience needs to look like this. And up to this point, the individual can use the mobile app without identifying themselves. But if they want something extra or they want to go to this other place, then we need to get a little information from them. And so how do we gather that information? So it's more of a progressive journey, and we're not necessarily driving it. It's the people that are delivering the user experience that drive it, but we absolutely have to be in tune with it on one ear. And on the other, we need to be listening to our privacy and security peers around what are the constraints that are in place? What are the requirements that are in place? I used to tell my customers back when I was an analyst that privacy puts important constraints on your identity interactions. And they would kind of look at me funny and say, here's the thing. Constraints breed creativity. So when we think about what you can and can't do with information, or what you should and should not be collecting, those are constraints on the user experience and on our systems. And that pushes you, it breeds creativity, and it pushes you as an identity professional to deliver the best, most secure services you can given those constraints. And so I think it's a great thing to have, obviously I'm biased because I love this industry, but to be sitting between the people that are delivering the services and the user journey and the people, security and privacy, who are providing meaningful, greatly important constraints that push us to be more creative in our service delivery.
When you say constraints breeds creativity, that makes me think of how some of the best authorship happens when you have a word limit to an article.
Absolutely. There is nothing worse than a blank page, right? You just sit there and stare. We used to joke, systems that allow you to do anything make it hard to do anything, right? It's like, I could do anything, but I don't even know where to begin. Whereas, if you have a line of business that says, I really want to be able to let people use social identities to get access to and register for more information about our product lines. But I want to do that consistently across mobile and our web properties. Like, there you go. There's a nice set of boundaries. And then you go off and you talk to your security peers in terms of service delivery. You go to your privacy peers and talk about the constraints around maybe certain industry puts in place, certain geography puts in place. And then you've got this nice constrained, you know what? I know the spiritual word limit on this delivery, right? I know what I got to do. Yeah. And you can absolutely hit it out of the park. But if you're given that blank sort of provide access to stuff, man, it's so hard to succeed in those settings.
Let's talk about this other organization you've been involved in, Identity Ecosystem. Tell me a little bit about that, what IDESG is and what you did for them, what were you doing for them?
Absolutely. So the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group is a public-private partnership. And it was spun up out from the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. Now, that was a Department of Commerce-led initiative, a program that came out of President Obama's cybersecurity review going back some years ago. And the goal was to provide a way, adherent to the NSTIC principles, things including usability, security, resilience, privacy protection, voluntary services, that would help unlock the economic engine of this country. Because if we think about one of the fundamental challenges we have is we recognize that the internet is an enormous economic engine for the U.S. But we also know that, and the president writes about this in the opening letter of the NSTIC program, that because of issues of trust, whether the individual doesn't trust the service doesn't have good trust in the individual, that untold numbers of businesses were not able to deliver the best service they could because we get hamstrung over issues of identity and trust. And so the NSTIC was formed, the program was formed to help address some of those things. And out of that came the IDESG. And I've been involved with that. I live in Washington, D.C. I happened to be involved with it before the NSTIC was formally created. And then subsequently through that, I joined the management council, first board, if you will, of the IDESG, and was on it for 4 years. And activities included creation of what we call the Identity Ecosystem Framework. And that is a set of documents, a functional model that describes the how and the what of identity interactions, as well as a set of requirements around usability, around privacy, around security. And these together make a baseline of practices. Because here's the thing, going back to our previous conversation about not having that word limit makes it awfully hard to write a great piece.
Yeah.
There are so many companies out there who struggle to tackle issues of identity and trust because in some cases they don't know how to ask the questions. They're confronted with a blank page. And so the Identity Ecosystem Framework gives a sort of baseline that says, if you want to be a good actor, if you want to be a trustworthy individual or organization on the web, here's some things that you should do. And it's from being able to consume third-party identities to making sure that you're collecting only the appropriate amount of information for the purpose that you declare, basically giving a baseline. And so that's the first big piece of work we've done is these committees that are part of the IDESG working on interoperability, security, privacy, and all these important topics have come together to create this framework, really this baseline that says, here's the minimum you need to do to be a good egg on the internet when it comes to identity and trust. The second thing we're doing is we are in the process of building a registry. And this is a place where people that adhere to the framework, that actually meet the requirements that we laid out, can self-attest, yes, I do these things, so that they can describe what their role is on the internet. So maybe they're an identity provider, they're a credential service provider, for example, and I do these things, right? I meet these requirements. And we hope this listing service is going to become a clearinghouse for people to come, both enterprise and individuals, to say, hey, who are trustworthy partners? Who's doing the right thing by identity information? And that's valuable to our citizens. It's valuable to our enterprises. So that's some of the things we've been working on at the IDESG, and we're very excited for the shortly forthcoming release of this registry so that people now have a place to go to say, hey, who's doing the right stuff with my identity data?
It's clear listening to you. It's clear you're, obviously really passionate. You're really knowledgeable of the subject. Tell me a little bit about why you like this topic so much, or and how you got into it.
Sure. So I got into identity management accidentally. I was working at a large technology company straight out of college, and I'd done there for a couple of years, and I got really close with one of my regional sales managers, and he got recruited by an identity company called Access 360. And excuse me. And so he asked me to come along with him to his interview, so I could basically decode the technology language for him so he could figure out if he was gotten a snow job or something. In the course of the process, I didn't realize I was getting recruited too, because I was young and kind of dumb. And I found myself working at this identity company. And I really found an affinity to it because it was visceral in the sense that we all have a very personal, visceral reaction to our own identities and to issues of our own privacy. And when I start to see how the process of working for enterprise identity could lead to individual identity and issues of self-sovereign control of our own identity information and the implications on privacy, this just became more and more fascinating. And I also fell in love with the people in the industry. I just really had great interactions with people that became mentors, became close allies and friends, and really started loving the subject matter. And that's how it kind of happened. And I certainly didn't plan on it. And, well, back in the day, there was no such thing as a degree in identity management, and well, that's starting to change. But it became just an interesting passion of how identity information moves, how it's managed, how it's controlled, how it's protected, and that's kept me going through a lot of different companies and a lot of different roles inside in the industry.
Interesting. I've interviewed a lot of people, and you're not the first person. Maybe not surprised. You're definitely not the first person who's commented on how this whole privacy space is such a collegial and collaborative, and there's just a lot of sharing going on. I'm not saying that other industries don't do that, but I think there's something about privacy and the nature of it that kind of perhaps lends itself to that. But I have heard that from a number of interviewees.
It blows my mind. I remember going to IAPP, I want to say probably 10 years ago. Obviously a much smaller event than the one we just had.
Right.
And both the closeness of connection within industry, so the higher education identity people know each other, and the life sciences identity privacy people, know each other, but also across private sector and academic. Like, so this person's doing research over here, and these life sciences companies are taking advantage of the research that she's doing, for instance. So I very much liked that, and it's something that the identity industry, we've emulated on a rudimentary scale. Unlike privacy, unlike security, identity management doesn't have a professional organization. We haven't really professionalized our industry, and that's something I'm working on to see if we can change, because I think that organizations like IAPP, for example, provide such a service to privacy professionals in terms of developing their own careers, developing success of their own programs. I really like to emulate that in the identity world so that we can reap some of the same benefits.
Well, Ian, it's been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate your taking the time to educate me about identity management. I look forward to checking in with you in a couple of years and learning how the field is growing.
Thanks so much for having me here. Happy to chat again.
This is Richard Chu and Ian Glazer. Thanks.